So tonight's presentation is going to unfold into various sequences. First, I will give the floor to Professor Paola Vigano and Professor Eric Verrecchia, my co-supervisor, who will introduce tonight's presentation. Then I will give an about 1 hour presentation of my doctoral research. Then we will take a few rounds of questions and answer, and I will finish with some acknowledgement. Okay, so Paola, Eric, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Antoine, and we are all, I think, very happy to be here with you in this moment. That is a very, very important one, and it is really the conclusion of a long trajectory. And of course, I imagine there is a lot of also of emotion and a little bit of tension, but I think that you will be perfect in your presentation. Just a few words about Antoine. That I met, I think, more or less 5 or 6 years ago, Antoine.
Yeah,
more or less. And then at a certain moment, Antoine decided, and I decided with him to look for funds for a PhD research, and then we started this preparation of a possible research project that was in the idea to reflect on the soils in the contemporary city. So not really the soils that traditionally interest the pedologist, but neither the soils that traditionally interest the urbanist and the architect. That has a very abstract relation with soil normally. I mean, soil, they are there, but in fact, their project is often forgetting about the qualities of soil. We wanted to look at the urban, or let's say, soils that are into the dynamics of the transformation of the contemporary city. We were really interested to understand what is the interest and the value of those soils. And Antoine took, I have to say, a lot of enthusiasm about this theme, and he revised also his formation, his education. Of course, Antoine is an architect, so he had to transform it himself a little bit in a hybrid between an architect, urbanist, and a pedologist. And this took us some time, and I think it was also a very tiring process that Antoine really went through with a lot of rigor and a lot of putting a lot of resources and time in this process to construct, in fact, a different Antoine, because that's the point. Today, Antoine is different from the one I met 5 or 6 years ago. So Antoine is an architect, as I said. He has been a fellow of the French Academy in Rome, the Villa Medici. That is always a very good experience. He has been working in several schools, and he has worked and is working today at the Laboratory of Urbanism at the EPFL, and also at the Habitat Research Center at the same EPFL. During his PhD, he was lucky enough to work in this context, but also to spend some time at the MIT together with Professor Alan Berger in his research center, that is the Löwenthal Center for Advanced Urbanism. And I think that also this experience was important for his reflection. The PhD of Antoine has this title, Our Common Soils, which is already a beautiful title. That is also the title of this research that we started with Antoine and other persons. The Swiss city territory as a renewable resource. So in fact, it's already containing several hypotheses, this title, and he will discuss these hypotheses. As Antoine already said, we had the pleasure to work together as supervisors with Eric Verrecchia, and that is a professor, pedologist at UNIL. And I have to thank, let's say, Antoine for putting Eric in contact with myself, and I really took a lot of pleasure in discussing with Eric about soils and all different stories that are around soils. And his research topic looks at the anthropogenic transformation of urban soils. And his territory is what we call the Alpine Lemanic city territory. So that city that is around the lake, but is also including different types of territories, like important mountains. I don't think it is necessary to go more in detail about the content of the thesis. Antoine will do it much better than me, but I would like that also Eric Verrecchia maybe can bring a word before asking Antoine to start. So Eric, if you want to.
Here we are. Thank you very much, Paola. Yes, I mean, I'm just going to add a few words. What is interesting, it's the first time I had really the opportunity to talk to Antoine. He was on the phone. It was a long time ago, as you said, Paola, probably 6 years ago. He called me, he called my office at UNIL to ask if we would be interested to help a group of architects and urbanists to assess urban soils. And I was very surprised. But a couple of weeks later, if you remember, Paola, we had a lunch and we decided really to join the adventure. It was really very fascinating. I have to confess that Antoine was extremely convincing. He had not only a large knowledge, but he was passionate. And he put to his subject, the passion he put to his subject never waned. I mean, it was all along, you know, the PhD duration. In fact, I didn't have choice. I really had to follow him and Paola in this adventure because it was really fascinating. You'll see during his presentation that Antoine is not only an urbanist, but also he became a sort of soil scientist. He really put together both the scientific approaches and was able to bring new concepts in order to sort of to emphasize the huge potential of urban soil history and future to mitigate the city territory environment. And I'm sure you will probably really appreciate a lot his public defense. It's always a pleasure to see a PhD research ending, not only because a new person will join the community of doctors, but also because if this PhD is over, that means that the research was successful. Antoine's research was really successful. He defined precisely the process on what we call anthropogenic soil, which is sort of a transformation, but what he emphasized, it's really the role of historical, retrospective, in fact, history of the soil, but also he tried to put it in sort of a projective way. What is important, in fact, we have to keep in mind that in our countries, the soil is all the time under the pressure of mankind. And in fact, what Antoine's tried to say, it's on say with success, it's that in the town you have to take into account the soil, because the soil is not only in history, but it's a material. It's a new type of interface between life and mineral world. So he tried to apply this more theoretical concept to the contemporary metropolitan areas, and he focused on the urban development of the West Lausanne post-industrial district in the frame of the Lausanne-Morges agglomeration. A lot of us, we know where it is. So what I hope now is that the policymakers and the town managers will get advantage of this absolutely remarkable work. In my opinion, Antoine provided to the scientific community a sort of an exceptional piece of work. And I want already to congratulate him for his ability to break the borders between different disciplines in order to demonstrate that innovation is always at the frontiers of disciplines and not inside the disciplines. So congratulations, Antoine, and I hope you will find the time to publish your manuscript as a book, because for me, it's really a real milestone.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Paola. So this doctoral research is entitled Our Common Soils, West Lausanne Urbanization as Anthropedogenesis, a section through the time and spaces of urban soils. It is dedicated to the Rhone Glacier and its many sediments, because we and the soils we live on are made of them, because what they have left behind is a three-dimensional space in which we inhabit, produce, and communicate. But I would like to dedicate tonight's presentation to the memory of, to the memory of Rosemary Perrin-Vialle and Madeleine Faletti-Blanchard. As volunteer school teacher and librarian, these two women were models for doctoral students. But my late beloved grandmothers had a special skill that has a lot to do with tonight's topic. They were able to find very elegant solutions to repair the small scattered holes that moss used to make in the woolly fabric of my clothes. We urbanists and urban planners in the French-speaking part of Switzerland knows that these little holes are a serious issue. So we used it as a metaphor to designate what is considered as our biggest problem. Le mitage du territoire en français. Zersiedlung of Dutch. A dislocated, dispersed, or even dysfunctional urbanization. In English, we say urban sprawl, but we will see that this translation is quite inaccurate to designate the phenomenon of a dispersed urbanization all over the Swiss plateau, the Mittelland, that is also characteristic of Europe in general. And you see on this map, these little holes, you can see West Lausanne. So this urbanization was called already by Rousseau, a big city, la Suisse comme grande ville. Later, it was called by urban historian André Corbeau, the ville territoire, the city territory. And today, this form of urbanization is highly criticized in the name of soil. So what is soil? In French, in Italian, in German, the three languages of the Swiss Confederation, but also in many technical and scientific languages, the word soil has a polysemic meaning ranging from the earth, the land, the ground, or even the floor. But in the recent decades, the meaning that this word has for ecology, a living system, the thickness of which range from a few centimeters to 1 or 2 meters maximum, has gained a renewed importance because soils are crucial, they are essential for the maintenance of the inhabitability of the territory, especially when it is urban. So, this inversion of values, this new look at soil, led me to study urbanization as a process of Anthropedogenesis, the transformation of soil by human. And this entailed to document, to explain, and to criticize urban soils, not only as a living system, but also as a project, a design project, both in retrospective and prospective times, and in space at different scales. So, for geographer Claude Raffestin, Soils are a time pocket or an anti-hazard mechanism because depending on their physical properties, that can vary also according to human impacts, they perform many functions. And from the human point of view, these functions are regarded as ecosystem services. Soil are the support in which biomass and food grow. They absorb the carbon that is now in a too large proportion in the atmosphere as greenhouse effect gas. They absorb also stormwater, and they release it through evapotranspiration to cool down the atmosphere of urban heat island. They are support for biodiversity, and they also contain contaminants. So both this spatial and ecological dimension of soils led to the elaboration of various spatial structures, territorial structures, in Switzerland in particular, on the long term, that were inspired by the German notion of Innenkolonisation, and which led to the specific territorial development in Switzerland as fully inhabited and productive territory. For example, Armin Meili's decentralized concentration, which regarded Switzerland as a große Stadt, range spanning from Geneva to St. Gallen, are the famous mesh Briard, an agropark system that was meant to structure the urban development in the Geneva basin, or the plan that Friedrich Wallen conceived to put every soils, and including urban soils, to cultivation during World War II in order to achieve food sufficiency at the national level. In 2014, the Spatial Planning Act in Switzerland was revised in the name of a measured use of the land, une utilisation mesurée du sol. Okay, in order to protect the arable land in the name of this functional dimension of soil, urbanization was made to be reoriented toward existing areas and casting urban soils as priority development. This paradigm of Innenentwicklung, inner urbanization, therefore raised a paradox between sprawl and overdensification and the potential conflict of uses of soil in the city territory. Okay, so this research somehow analyzed how this inner urbanization principle was implemented at two different political and spatial entities, the Lausanne Morges agglomeration in the Canton de Vaud, and more precisely, the West Lausanne district. Somehow, both the Innenkolonisation and Innenentwicklung, the inner colonization and inner urbanization, refer to a territorial interior which acknowledge the functionality of soils. Okay, these two notions contain in themselves a critique of the contemporary city and a specific project, as well as a specific consideration for the functionality of urban soils. Today, it is urgent to give an alternative meaning to this notion of soils as a territorial interior, which is supported by sometimes contradictory and also ideologically problematic paradigms that has inspired the Swiss social, territorial, and environmental project. Okay, so this reflection is based in the first place on the concept of progetto di suolo, the project for the ground, coined by urbanist Bernardo Secchi. In the context of the postmodern debate on the contemporary city, Bernardo Secchi said that we need to shift the focus from the built objects to the space in between things, lo spazio tra le cose. The ecological dimension of soil also re-emerged in the context of post-industrial shrinking cities, such as Detroit, which was one of the locus of the landscape urbanism movement in the US. Both of these approaches have in common to somehow formulate a critique, an analysis of the contemporary city, which is not, and diffuse urbanization, which is not only formulated in the negative terms of urban sprawl and soil consumption, but which also acknowledge the large amounts and diversity of soils embedded in the city as an asset for sustainable development. This research is also based on the work of soil scientist Dan Yallen, who was a pioneer of anthropedology. From new soils to soils as a human natural body, Yallen defined an ethic of humankind not only as soil consumer and soil destroyer, but also as soil transformer and producer. He defined soils through the notion of polygenesis as an inherited material that is constantly reprocessed and recycled in the frame of a cohabitation between humans and soils. I was struck by the fact that when Yallen referred to soils as palimpsest, a text that is written and written again over the same material, he is explicitly aware of the fact that the concept of palimpsest was very important also for architects and urban planners, such as André Corbeau, who described the city territory as a palimpsest. So ultimately, the final goal of this PhD is to provide somehow a compass in order to guide urbanization towards sustainable development, and to consider urbanization as an active strategy for soil development and valorization. I will go later more in details to describe this diagram. So, in order to achieve this research, I developed a theoretical framework. The thing is, if we are to guide urbanization based on the quality of soil, the problem is, in the soil map, all the urban areas are systematically represented as a white spot, illustrating somehow a knowledge gap regarding urban soils that this research intended to fill. To do that, I relied upon soil science and the science of anthropedology, which acknowledged the human impact on soils and in particular urbanization as a factor of soil transformation. The model elaborated by Dan Yallen and other people also integrated process responses. The originality of my research is to develop these models by introducing the concept of soil historical and projective trajectories. Through this quite complex diagram, I mostly focus on two soil trajectories. The first one is the trajectory through which soils are affected by cultivation. Cultivation, as a factor of soil change, constantly affects the natural factor of soil formation, leading to the production of anthrosoils. The second trajectory that was the focus on my work is the trajectory in which humans, urbanization, change the parent material of soils, the substrate of the soil, leading to the development of either pseudo-natural soils or technosoils. Okay? In a more concrete way, somehow urbanization combines these different trajectories through main process of soil change. In the first place, urbanization moved the earth. In Lausanne, it has moved the earth in gigantic proportion. Here you can see the example, for those who know Lausanne, the example of the front, which is related to the burying of a river, to the dump of our wastes, construction waste and domestic waste into a gigantic dump site, and also to the transformation of topography in order to implement transportation corridors and logistic platforms. To illustrate this, I found in the archive of the city of Lausanne a letter that is written by the chief of the construction work department, who answered to a journalist who is complaining that the construction work of a public park, the public park of Valency in Lausanne, was delayed. And he explained that at the period, people have moved so much soils, especially in Lausanne, that the earth is missing. The second factor through which the city territory impacted the soil is that it established a mixed-use mesh all over the territory. As you can see in this image of Bussigny, agriculture is intertwined with industry and also mining. In here you can see a gravel pit, which is typical of the Swiss plateau. Okay, so this very mixed-use mesh and the influence of a former agricultural territory also influenced the establishment of a specific planning tools, le plan de quartier, for example, which allowed for the development of larger operations on the former bourgeois land holdings, which was agricultural land holdings, les fameuses campagnes lausannoises, as you can see on the right of this image. To illustrate this, I found these moving letters written by Edouard Amiguet, a farmer and vine grower who used to farm the land of an old lady before the Valency Park was established. And he's writing to the city at the moment in which the city buy the land to build the park. And he says, will I be able to farm the land this season? And if not, is there any other place available so that I can farm the land? So this process of soil transformation through urbanization was investigated in this research through various research operations. Basically, these research operations were applied to a case study, West Lausanne, through a field campaign. For example, here we made a field trip with landscape architect Gilles Clément. We also discussed and interviewed various actors and stakeholders of the soil transformation. This old lady is managing a community garden in the former industrial platform of Malais. And this social dimension of the soil transformation was also experienced through a design experiment in the form of an ephemeral garden, l'Incise, that I realized together with non-site office in the Parc de Valency for the festival Lausanne Jardin, which offered me the opportunity to study at scale 1 process of soil transformation and also in its interaction with local policies and public opinion. To conduct the field work, I used the 3 main tools that are usually mobilized by soil scientists. Cartography. I realized an atlas of urban soils in West Lausanne. Soil description. I realized 6 urban soils portraits and soil sequences. I will explain later more in depth what is a soil sequence. So this is the extent of the atlas which was realized, which means to fill in the white spot that was on the map that I showed you before. And to realize this atlas, I compiled various heterogeneous documents from old maps to the topographic maps, aerial views, and a LiDAR point cloud, very precise scanning of the territory. All these various heterogeneous documents were gathered together in a GIS, Geographic Information System. Here's some screenshots of the mapping operations. So digitalization and feature recognition on historical maps, dating of these maps, it's like a decoupage, and then reclassification of this point cloud in order to obtain an almost photographic imprints of the impact of urbanization on soil. This is a detail of the maps that were produced. Second, soil profile descriptions. 6 soils were described as a snapshot in time, representing the influence of past urbanization. And this soil description also provides scientific evidence in order to assess their potential resilience in the future. So these are the 6 soils that were selected in order to document these different soil trajectories. So to document a soil, to analyze a soil, we dig a pit. Description of soil has a lot to do with forensic science. It has somehow also a kind of mystic dimensions. And finally, the elaboration of a soil sequence. Usually, soil scientists describe a logical sequence of soil according to topography, a topo sequence, or according to time, a chrono sequence. This kind of sequences prove to be more difficult in the urban environment because the topographic logic of soil in the city doesn't only follow the gravitational logic of water. And also because the influence of man through time changes. So for example, some example of chronotopo sequence in the urban environments. So in order to establish a coherent sequence of soil, I used various data regarding the physical properties of soils, the biogeochemical properties of soils, and I constructed a sequence that is both in time and topography, a chronotopo sequence or anthropo sequence that is based on this notion of soil trajectory in order to somehow reproduce the ideal life of a soil from a natural soil to a soil that is put into cultivation, agriculture, then which becomes a green space, and ultimately that becomes urban wilderness, such as urban forest, for example. So to do this, we did soil sampling. So we did a lot of, we took a lot of soil core using an auger. Then we dug pits. We sampled soils for each horizon of the soil, each layer of the soil. We prepare them in order to do lab analysis, in order to assess their biochemical properties and also to have a sense of the biological activity that is in the soil. So I will present you briefly the results of this research. The first result of this research is an atlas composed of three main layers. The first layer refers to geomorphology, the form and the formation of the geological bedrock that is underneath the soil. We individuated hillsides, the lower relief, the sunken relief along rivers, and also the anthropic superficial deposits that is brought by humans and which in Lausanne can be in gigantic proportions once again. The second layer of this atlas refers to land cover. I realized two maps of the land cover, one at the beginning of the 20th century and one today, in order to compare them and to compare proportions. To give you a very basic idea, today, West Lausanne territory, a third of it is covered by asphalt or buildings. A third of it is still in agricultural use or forest use. And the last third of it is composed by all the open soils, all the open surface that are not in agricultural use and that are composed of backyards, green spaces, and any other kind of tiers paysage, brownfields. Okay, so if I compare these two maps, the first interpretation of it is a total destruction of the former agricultural landscape. As you can see in red here, all the surfaces of the field that disappeared throughout the 20th century. The only type of land cover that remain are the woods because they were in Switzerland very well protected by the law since at least 1 century. But what we can see in green here is the emergence of a completely new, almost completely new type of land use that is including all the open soils that are not in agricultural use. I call this ambiguous type of land use the garden, which is composed once again about backyards, the right of way of infrastructures, brownfields, etc. And I tried to reconstruct the emergence through time of this garden. I tried to map it and to quantify the evolution of this land cover. So this map can be decomposed in various sequences that express garden as a dynamic morphology that is evolving through time. The third layer of this atlas is dedicated to the urban sediments, all the earth that is moved following the implementation of urban structures, such as mining, buildings, roads, railways, the burying of rivers, the reclaimed land, cemeteries, landfills, etc. This layer was also quantified through time and decomposed into chronological reading. And here you can see the evolution of these urban morphologies from a mesh of equidistant villages that is that somehow is densified globally through time along the transportation corridors in the first way, and then it becomes a mixed-use mesh that is now almost saturated. And this urbanization process is not urban sprawl. It's a more diffused and complex spatio-temporal pattern, okay, the city territory, that I can somehow decompose into two main periods. The first one is the first half of the 20th century, in which you can see these equidistant villages that are, and the territory between them that is gradually turning into a mixed-use territory, intertwining agriculture, industry, and housing. And at this period, somehow the urbanization happened plot by plot along the roads, in giving, according to a consideration for soil that is still productive. If you have a piece of open soil next to your building, is to grow vegetables. And somehow, so here you can see a detail of the Malais industrial zone in Lausanne and how it evolved through time as a palimpsest. And this is a soil that is that is used as a community garden in the industrial platform of Malais. And I was surprised when we see this soil that corresponds to this first half of the 20th century, because I was expecting a soil very impacted by humans, since it's urbanized. It has been urbanized for a long time now. But actually, we were surprised to find a soil that is quite in place. As you can see, there is a quite thick brown layer that is typical of horticultural use and also of former plowing horizons, because this soil used to be a field. It's very dark because there is a lot of organic matter in it. It's also a little bit polluted because of the use of Bordeaux mixture. But it lays on top of a series of layers that are lighter, sandy layers that were naturally brought by the flooding of rivers that were in this area before urbanization. So it's a soil that has been protected by its functional use as a garden. If we look now at the second part of the 20th century, we see immediately a scaling up in terms of urbanization. Urbanization happened on a much larger scale, according to a modernist project that is allowed by this implementation of new urban and planification tools, les plans spéciaux, that allows for the development of much larger housing developments, infrastructure, campuses, logistic platform, etc. And this modernist project of urbanization, which was in the first place driven by sanitary reasons, give a lot of importance to the soil. That is extremely important in the green spaces between buildings, etc. Maybe in a much larger proportion than before, but this soil has less a functional dimension and more of an ornamental dimension, which leads to somehow higher impacts. This is the soil that is in front of the library in the university campus of UNIL, the banana, for those who knows. And this soil is actually quite impacted. As you can see, there is a very thin layer of fertile land that was brought over a very thick layer, which is made of construction waste. In this layer, you can find everything: concrete blocks, pieces of wood, in here, even wires, and also very small little welding balls of metal, les billes de soudure, that came from the construction works and that were somehow hidden under the soil in a layer that is also very compacted. Okay, so this study of the influence of urbanization on soils led to the elaboration of an original map. This map is not a soil map, nor a soil quality map. It's a mapping of the trajectory, of the soil trajectory. So it's a mapping of the ongoing pedogenetic dynamics that are affecting a territory at a certain time. As you can see, now in West Lausanne, a third of the territory is somehow in a situation in which dynamics are frozen by building up or by the implementation of an impervious layer of asphalt or concrete. Soil sealing. Okay, 1/3 of the territory is sealed. Another third, in blue, is affected by an anthropogenic parent material, by cut and fill and earth movement. And the third, last third of the territory is affected by cultivation. Okay? I could have compared the proportion of this contemporary map to the map that I realized for the beginning of the 20th century. You can see the colors are very different and the soil dynamics are very different. But what interests me is more to compare this contemporary map to a map of the future, a map that could be the map of 2050. Because what we need as urbanists is not a map of soil, a contemporary map of soil. What we need in order to plan the city of tomorrow is the soil map of tomorrow. And this implies to have a dynamic vision of soil that is focused on soil transformation rather than the current soil quality. So I'm not ready to do this map yet. Hopefully one day I will be able to draw it, but not now. Yet I can, in order to foresee this map, there is two things. First, we need to understand better what are the soil change dynamics that are ongoing to the territory now, and then to have an idea of what's going to be in the future. So first, what is now? If we look at the different soils through time, you see that their properties are fluctuating, because through time, not only urban soil ages, but the human influence on soils change. If we look at the different properties of soils according to their position in the space, it's also quite fluctuating, because, as we saw, the influence on of man on soils doesn't follow a topographic logic. Neither it can be limited to a center-periphery gradient. We have seen that urbanization follows a much more complicated spatio-temporal pattern. But if we look at the different trajectories according to a chronotopo sequence or anthropo sequence, then a kind of coherent narrative emerged. At least it allowed us to identify highest impacts and somehow a gradation in the resilience of the soil. Resilience understood as the capacity of the soil to rebound and to be affected by pedogenetic processes that are comparable to natural soils. So I will decompose somehow this anthropo sequence according to three systematic patterns. The two first patterns, pattern A and pattern B, concern the influence of urbanization on soils through sedimentation and cultivation. If we look at sedimentation, we see an highest impact, for example, an highest pH, on the soils that were tipped during the second half of the 20th century with the most invasive techniques. if we look at the influence of cultivation and, according to pattern A, so the highest impact in the second half of the 20th century, but somehow this impact is followed by a response that is quite natural. For example, a decarbonation process. And this somehow allows us to compare urbanization as a very large-scale process of natural deglaciation. Urbanization moved the Earth and compacted just like glaciers do. The second pattern, the one concerning cultivation, is somehow more problematic, but because we see that the agricultural impact on soil, the cultivation, somehow impoverish the soil and interrupt the natural cycles of organic matter, of carbon, and life in soil. But what is interesting is that we see a clear gradation in the resilience from intensive agriculture, which is the worst impact, to green spaces that are somehow in a better condition, and the best resilience is achieved through urban wilderness, such as forests, for example. So through these two patterns, they reflect a gradual dismantlement of the former agricultural landscape, with two spikes in intensity, which correspond to the main urbanization waves in the first and second part of the 20th century. These two spikes in intensity in terms of urban growth also corresponded to some thresholds in the cultural and technical evolution of our relation to the soil. We change the way we consider soil, whether as ornamental or productive, and we change also the technique through which we impact it. The third pattern is not describing the influence of urbanization on the native landscape, but on the contrary, how the native landscape still have an effect on urbanization. What I saw, it's a very small scientific evidence, but still, is that there is some spikes in the chemical input in the soil in certain places that adhere to the sunken relief, the lower relief of the territory. Why the lower relief of the territory, the lower part of the territory are more polluted with more chemical impacts? Probably, so this chemical impact can be related to cultivation practices and horticulture. They can be related also to transportation, the pollution through automobile, and also, but it's not very obvious in West Lausanne, to industrial activities. Why are they concentrated in the lower relief of the territory? For two hypotheses. Either the water percolating drive the contaminants towards these zones through a process of colluviation, or either because this is where the lower relief, where the most polluting activities are concentrated. What we can see also is this adherence of the urbanization to the topography is stronger at the beginning of the 20th century, and somehow through the progressive saturation of the urban mesh, it tends to disappear. The last part of this discussion is the fact that this work on the anthroposequence allowed us to analyze the performance of the soil using the DestiSoil model, a modelizing tool that is also a decision support tool that is under development by the Laboratory of Soil Environment of the University of Nancy, especially through the work of Geoffroy Serré. And the use of this tool on our data brought to a limited result, which is limited in reliability for many reasons. First, because this kind of tools require a huge quantity of data to achieve statistical validation, which is not our case. We only studied 5 soils, and also because we sampled the soils through the help of students. So it's not super reliable. And also because this model that tried to assess the functionality of soils are now under development, and they really represent the age of the state of the art. This is where the scientific community is now, and we have not found exactly the solution yet. Still, what we can see in this diagram is that are assessing various functions of soil, its fertility, its capacity to support biogeochemical and organic matter cycles, or to provide function against risks such as flooding by absorbing water or by containing contaminants. All these various curves, they are all situated between 2 and 3 on a scale of 3. So, and this is a very important findings. Urban soils, the urban soils that we studied, are functional, and they provide many functions that are essential for the maintenance of the habitability of our city, especially in the face of climate change and as regard to the necessity of a spatial, social, and energy transition of the city in order to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. Perspective now. What we can foresee for the future of these soils. So the future of soils is contained in one document, which is the planning policy ongoing on a certain territory. I tried to retrace the history of the planning policy on West Lausanne. And this is the current land use map, the zoning, le plan d'occupation du sol, which defines somehow the different land use that are allowed on a territory. This document in itself contains challenges and opportunities. For example, if we look at the actual land cover that is covering the soils according to various land uses and zoning, we can see, for example, that the zone that is dedicated to activities, industries, and services is the one that is more impervious, more seed, the one in which there is the most asphalt. Or we can see that both in activities and residential areas, there is a lot actually of open soils. So there is an open question regarding the future of these soils. And somehow, if we analyze the planning policy that is ongoing on this territory, we can identify 2 different types of measures. The first type of measure is dedicated to the valorization and to the densification of the territory. So in order to achieve Innenentwicklung, inner urbanization, inward urbanization, industrial zones and residential zones will have to be densified, okay? And this densified and requalified. This will trigger some trajectories that are some changes in trajectories as it is somehow drafted through gradients in the map on the right. So there is a first figure concerning pattern A, which represent all the industrial and residential platforms in the city that somehow represent a resource deposit. These platforms are going to be requalified, restructured in the future. And this is an opportunity to valorize soils because in this platform, there will be an increase in the building volumes and building zones. And so there will be an increase in anthrosedimentations. But we could imagine that this increase in buildings will be accompanied by a decrease in sealed surface, a decrease in the surface that is covered with asphalt. If we look at the reality of the projects that are ongoing on the territory, we see that this objective is not always achieved, and it's easier to achieve it when we are when it's happening on a territory that is already urbanized. We are more efficient when we act upon the city that is existing, rather than when we develop former agricultural land. So this underlines somehow a necessity to reinvent and re-elaborate the urban morphologies that we architects are designing. And somehow, if we look at this soil sequence, we can foresee in the future new soils that will be implemented and surfaces that are reopened. And those soils will have to be less made from other soils that are recycled with remnant properties, and will have to be designed using and recycling our construction and domestic waste. Okay, we will have to recycle the material we produce in order to produce new soils. The second set of measures are the ones that tend to valorize the existing open soils embedded in residential and mostly residential urban fabric, backyards, and green spaces, to valorize them in order to somehow produce a mesh of open soils and public space that structure the territory. This map in black, what you see is not the buildings. What you see is the open soils. This map somehow refers to not a gray density, the density of buildings that we usually consider. It's a green density, the density of open spaces and voids. Okay, so what we can foresee is that garden, the urban garden, the open soils that go along with buildings, its surface is going to grow also in the future, but it will have to be diversified in terms of vegetal cover. This garden will have to include woods, it will have to include vineyards, it will have to include meadows. Okay, if we look at what's actually happening in the territory in this, we can see a clear improvement in cultivation and soil maintenance practices when the land is public. In parks, forests, and campuses, there is a clear improvement. We now mow the meadows using animals and not machines. We leave spaces for biodiversity, etc. Whether this improvement is also happening in private gardens and private lands, I'm not sure, and it remains as an open question, which was not documented in this PhD. So in here, we can also see, we can imagine new soil trajectories regarding to new forms of gardens. And finally, the third pattern alludes to the fact that the native landscape, the former geomorphology on which the city is built, now only manifests itself through risks and impacts, concentrations of risks and impacts. The most impacted, the most sealed soils are the ones that are situated once again in the lower relief, where there is the maximum risk of flooding, when there is the maximum risk of pollutions, and where the rivers were buried, interrupting the ecological network and the network of biodiversity. So soils in the future will have to be renewed, enhancing their contextuality, where they are, and somehow we will have to design new soils that will have to be water and contaminant filters or support for biodiversity. So somehow these different patterns and trajectory somehow create altogether what could be a toolbox for the urbanist of the future. They also define somehow a compass in order to guide urbanization towards sustainable development and to consider urbanization as an active strategy of pedogenesis, an active strategy of soil valorization. This compass somehow defines the territory as an emergent property of the management of soil as both a capital and a resource through soil changes and land cover changes. The stock of soil and the function provided by the soils are both affected by historical influences, whether natural or anthropogenic. The soil services and soil availability is also depending on the efficiency of various land cover types. So not only the efficiency of open soils, but also the efficiency of transportation surfaces, of built volumes, and also the degree of the variable degree of soil resilience. Both of these somehow drivers evolve fastly and through time, on a time that is decades. Okay, they can be also valorized through soil reopening, desealing, and through soil regeneration, land reclamation. Okay, through this various strategy, urbanization the project for the ground appears as a set of new urban morphologies and practices related to gardening and sedimentation, the adequacy and efficiency of which must be assessed in the frame of a city territory in transition as regard to evolving needs regarding environmental changes and demographic changes. Some words of conclusion. I was wondering what's new in this research. Actually, when a research is really transdisciplinary, there is always someone who knew the facts that a research brings to light. For example, there is a lot and very diversified quantity of open soil in the city territory, in the contemporary city. Some urbanists know that, or that urban soils evolved very quickly. This is something that soil scientists also knew. Almost everything was known, yet some facts was ignored in the sense that they were not taken into considerations. I will give you this example. This is a forest soil in West Lausanne. This soil is called Cambi soil, which is the name of a natural soil. Yet it is totally artificial. As you can see here, there is a layer of a big layer of stones that cannot be natural. So this soil is made by humans. Usually soil scientists say that a Cambi soil takes about 2,500 years to form. This soil, if we look at the story of its land use, this soil is only 10 years older than me. So his life can be framed on a human anthropogenic time frame of decades. This soil has somehow less than 50 years, okay? And this changes completely the deal through which inner urbanization can be implemented, okay? Inner urbanization is usually somehow led by the idea that every planning document starts with the same sentence. Soil are not a renewable resource, which is true. Soils are not renewable on the anthropic time frame. Yet, the stock of urban soil can be regenerated very fastly on a time frame that corresponds to a few decades. And this opens up the way to an urban planning strategy that is not only preservationist, we need to protect arable land, but also that is meant to become an active strategy of soil change in the city. I give you a very concrete example. This garden that we realized, this ephemeral garden that we realized in Valency, this incise, was made on a soil that is somehow 80 years old. Okay, it was implemented in the 40s on top of a former Hortic anthrosoil, a vineyard soil. Okay, and this soil was called also a Cambi soil. We did this incision, so we destroyed these soils in order to create a garden. And then we had to reconstruct the soil because it was ephemeral. So we put back the earth in place, and this is what happened 1 year later. I asked to soil scientists, what's the name of this soil? It's not a Cambi soil anymore. It's a rego soil. It comes from regolis, the lithic material that is usually moved by rivers during flooding and that create new soils. As you can see, this soil is not the same anymore. It doesn't have the same biogeochemical properties. The evidence of this is the poppies that grew up on the scar. Poppies usually grows along roads on the soil that is moved in between the road and the fields. So see, it's a new soil created within the time frame of almost 1 year. This is a radical experiment, but still it shows how urbanization can be framed, not only on a preservationist vision, but also in a vision that integrates soil change. So somehow, this is really the conclusion, the inward urbanization principle, this idea that the city must grow over itself, can lead to very different vision. This is the first vision in which somehow correspond to the metropolization trend that is now now Switzerland is following after the revision of the Swiss Spatial Planning Act. And you can see in green the non-metropolitan territory of the Canton de Vaud, perceived as a rural hinterland of the Swiss plateau. And the red part is the building zone, which is mostly corresponding to the compact perimeter and which is perceived indistinctly as an opportunity for densification. And in between, the yellow zone is somehow all the soils that are in the metropolitan area, but that are not buildable, and that corresponds somehow to a green belt or a buffer zone that is intending to limit the growth of the city. Somehow this vision questions the very fine granularity of the urban soil, and this research somehow tried to downscale to the very fine granularity of soil. Let's look at this fine granularity of soils. What do we mean when we say that? This is what we can see of a soil when we really look at it very closely with a binocular microscope. As you can see, soil is made of mineral conglomerates that sometimes integrate anthropogenic artifacts. This is a piece of asphalt. This is a fragment of brick. And this is a very, very little welding board, and be the soudure, very small, as you can see, is enlarged a lot in this image. But the soils contain also organic matter and voids. And these voids allow the roots to go through the soils. And ultimately these voids support the life within the soil. So this relation between the matter, the plane, and the voids should somehow inspire us an alternative vision for the inner densification. And this is an alternative vision of the Lausanne Morge agglomeration, in which the green is this rural hinterland, which somehow delineate a much more territorial structure that run along the villages in the north and also percolate inside the city as a green infrastructure. The red is not the building zone indistinctly, but the actual surface of the building, which has to be improved in terms of efficiency, and that will grow, yes, but as less as possible, and preferably, my grandmother would say, in the most disseminated way. And in between, the yellow surfaces correspond to the garden of the 20th century. These surfaces that are not built, but that are within the built zone, and that are made of backyards, parks, but also some infrastructure right-of-ways, and also sealed surface, old parkings, etc., that must be reconditioned. This garden of the 20th century is the support, or could be the support, of what urbanist Bernardo Secchi called, through very beautiful words, un uso allargato del territorio, an enlarged, extended, and in-depth use of the territory. These open spaces were not ignored, but maybe we didn't look at them properly. And in order to conclude this presentation, let's look at them together. This is the Parc de Valency in Lausanne, with this man-made soil that was designed 80 years ago by architect Alphonse Laverrière as an idealized vision of the hillsides that run in front of this beautiful panorama of Lausanne. This soil embodies somehow what urbanist Bernardo Secchi called una densità di significato, a densely meaningful material. Once the meaning of this material, the soil, was related to agriculture. Now it's not anymore related only to agriculture, but it's related to urbanization. As you can see, this park is part of a very thin network of open space and open soils that percolates through the city, that are the support for soft mobility network, and also a climatic network of fresh air that falls down from the hillsides to cool down the city. This open soils, this network of open soil is totally characteristic of the urbanization in Switzerland throughout the 20th century. We can wonder what can be the part of the inward urbanization of the 20th century. And it's interesting to try to answer this question, mirroring the history and trying to reconstruct alternative histories, mirroring it with future design challenges. Will this park be implemented on the sealed surfaces of former industrial platforms? Will this park be implemented on the last remaining agricultural plots embedded into the city territory that represent somehow the very last jackpots of some middle class and upper class family all around Europe? Will this park be implemented on the soils of the sunken relief that concentrated the most of impact, the most asphalted soils, the most polluted soils, but also potentially the more fertile ones? How will it be implemented on the sedimentary terrace by the lake that potentially can become the backbone of a large territorial structure? Somehow, soils, what I learned from soil scientists is that soil is a continuum. It's not only related to the performance of soil itself, it's also related to the performance of transportation surfaces. In the future, we will have to change the way we move and implement more efficient transportation surfaces. It's also related to the efficiency of the built volumes. We will have to change the way we shelter in a more efficient way as regard to energy. It's also related to our diet. We will have to change the way we eat. But, and this will be the conclusion of my research, in their apparent stillness, urban soils reflects our common future. Thank you very much for your attention.